news story that kind of dropped, a speculative news story, I guess I'll say,
Mm.
that was proposing that Netflix may be interested in buying Roku. It seems like reports since this initial one came out seems like it's probably not going to happen. But what would be the appeal to Netflix to purchase a company like Roku?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So this came up, as you said, about almost a week ago when Roku themselves prevented or closed the trading window for staff to sell vested shares, prompting a stock price jump and all this speculation. And I think the reason people jump to Netflix is because there are a lot of reasons it makes sense. And this is not like an out of the blue, out of nowhere, brand new idea. This has been thrown out there before. And I think what's really interesting is you have to really think about what kind of business Roku is. We don't talk about Roku because like we usually focus on what these companies make originally, and Roku does
Mhm.
that, but at a very small scale. But Roku is so much bigger than just being a middleman for streaming as the dominant set top box on the market. And against all odds, they seem to be the dominant option despite Amazon and Apple and Google being their main competitors. But that is the case. They're the dominant smart TV OS as well. But their business is based on services. That's where they make all their money. They
Mhm.
make like twice as much money on their services and their ad revenue as they do from their actual hardware sales. So they're not just a company that sells you something in Best Buy. And I think the reason it makes sense, is interesting for Netflix anyway, is Netflix recently announced that they're going to go into the ad game for the first time.
Right.
Something that was so against what Netflix has been about this whole time, obviously prompted by their first quarter of stagnant growth ever, and the stock price absolutely tanking recently, right? And doing ads at scale is not something that you can just like start and just start doing successfully. So I think one of the biggest appeals of them perhaps buying Roku is that they could really like get into the ad game in a major way by just kind of acquiring an advertising operation.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about, right? Because a Wells Fargo report came out that said that it would be cheaper if they did this, but it would still be pretty expensive to basically build out everything you would need to work ads into these platforms. And so I think it identified that it would be like at least 14% of the operating budget of Netflix to be building in all of this, all the
Mm.
necessary things for advertisement and sustaining it. So it's a big undertaking either way. So I get the appeal to Netflix of going for it. Yeah, I was surprised to see this report initially. I guess I just had never thought about it, and the more you dig into it, the more you see, as you kind of laid out, that Roku is just massive.
Mm.
It's one of those things where it's like almost like so ingrained, I think, into just like how we think about streaming that you don't actually think about how big it is. It was projected that in order to buy Roku, it would take probably around $17 billion, which I was just kind of blown away by. I didn't even realize that Roku was
Mm.
that big, and it goes back to what you talked about, the ad base and where they get the ads from. They run ads in so many different ways. They get it from so many different sources on so many different platforms that
Mm.
they just are massive, and it was pretty staggering. It, like I said, it seems like it's dead, but do you think there might be like some fire here where there's been just a tiny bit of smoke?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because even though it's expensive, Roku's a multi-billion-dollar company, as you said. It's not as expensive as it was like a year ago when I think it was Comcast was sniffing around, because
Mhm.
Roku's tank has also incredible dropped tremendously. So I think their evaluation is now around 13 billion. So what you said, them going over the top of that for that acquisition makes sense. Uh, but I mean, just to speak to their true size, there's like 60 million active Roku users, and it's like at the end of the day, they are a middleman, but they're such a dominant middleman that they can dominate ads, and specifically, they have 10% of Peacock's ad inventory, meaning that the ads that Peacock puts on all their stuff on their ad tiers, 10% of those ads, the money goes to Roku.
That's crazy.
And Peacock, NBC Universal, they had to play ball to that degree to get Roku to put them on Peacock on their service on Roku. So that just speaks to like how a strong position I think they're really in. And even if Amazon Fire TV is doing pretty well, like if Netflix picked up Roku, they would get this huge ad operation. They'd also get a lot of data. I think that's another interesting thing is would the other streaming services be super happy about Roku being owned by Netflix? The other side though, they probably wouldn't have much of a choice. They're not going to pull themselves off just like no streaming service pulled themselves off of Apple TVs or Amazon Fires before. So it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I think the big hindrance, right, would be if Netflix acquired Roku. What happens with all these partnerships where there's Amazon Prime and HBO and Apple TV, like you laid out, that are on these streaming platforms. Now they're supporting a platform that is providing to their competitors. It seems a bit messy, I guess, and I don't know I don't know how that would work out necessarily. So I think that would probably be the biggest hindrance to me, but I would be very interested to see how this plays out. I don't think this is the last we'll hear of it. I think Netflix is going to continue to explore ways to build out their company, obviously, and try to get some more juice behind them as they've had this big fall in stock price. So I'm sure we'll be talking about it. Do you have any last thoughts on the matter, though?
Yeah, on the one other piece would be this would be the first time that Netflix would have like a secondary business model
Mm,
of any real substance, which would be, of course, the Roku hardware being sold in stores and online. Uh, it's not as strong as Roku's ads, of course, but that would actually still be like a secondary income stream, which would be like the first time Netflix ever had one of those. Because again, they haven't had interest to this point. So, yeah, like you said, definitely a
yeah.
story that I'm sure will get talked about more moving forward, and I'm sure Roku in general acquisition will probably be a topic that'll continue.